Thank you so much, Hazel, for that introduction and for inviting Kettle's Yard to be part of this wonderful series of talks, particularly for this special 100th episode. And thank you everyone so much for tuning in. So first of all, I'll tell you about the remarkable story behind the creation of Kettle's Yard and introduce you to its founders, Jim and Helen Eade. And then I'll take you on a kind of the house, focusing on some of the key artworks and objects in the collection, including some of my personal favorites. So to start with the basics, Kettle's Yard is the former home of Jim and Helen Eade. They created it from 4 dilapidated cottages, filled it with beautiful artworks and objects, and donated it to the University of Cambridge in 1966. It was founded in 1957, so almost 70 years ago. And today, the Kettle's Yard house is almost exactly the same as when Jim and Helen Eade lived in it, and they left it when they retired to Edinburgh in 1973. It includes artworks by over 100 artists, including Barbara Hepworth, many of whom the Eades knew personally. Just as important as the artworks are the styles, glassware, furniture, and natural objects, all of which are harmoniously placed to create visual connections and correspondences. The play of light on the artworks and objects and architectural space was a key element of the Eade's aesthetic vision. And side by side with works by some of the big names of 20th century art history are little known amateur and even child artists, but for the Eades there was no distinction or hierarchy between them. So who were Jim and Helen Eade? So I think on the next slide I've got a photo of them. They were born in 1894 and 1895 respectively. Helen was a year older than Jim, and when they were born, Queen Victoria was still on the throne. By the time Jim Eade died in 1990, Margaret Thatcher was well into her premiership, so their lives effectively spanned the whole of the 20th century. When they founded Kettle's Yard, they were already in their 60s and had lived in Scotland, Morocco, America, and France, and in Jim Eade's case, India too. And Kettle's Yard can be seen as the culmination of work collected. They met in 1913 as students at the Edinburgh College of Art and married in 1921 at the Chelsea Register office. A few years later, they moved to a large house on Elm Road in Hampstead, where they kept an open house on Sunday afternoons, hosting lively get-togethers with artists, writers, musicians, politicians, and aristocrats. And through these soirees and Jim Eade's work as a curator at Tate, they came to know young British artists such as Christopher Wood and David Jones. And on trips to Paris, Jim Eade also encountered key figures of the international avant-garde, including Pablo Picasso, Juan Miró, and Constantine Brancusi. So maybe I'll go back to their marriage at the Chelsea Register office. So that happened in 1921, and then a few years later, they moved to Elm Row in Hampstead, where they kept an open house on Sunday afternoons and hosted lively get-togethers with artists, writers, musicians, politicians, and aristocrats. And this became the kind of template for the hosting that they undertook throughout their lives and culminated at Kettle's Yard. So through these soirees and Jim Eade's work as a curator at the Tate, they came to know many young British artists such as Christopher Wood and David Jones, and Jim Eade also undertook trips to Paris on Tate business, where he encountered key figures of the international avant-garde such as Pablo Picasso, Juan Miró, and Constantine Brancusi, and some of their works are in the Kettle's Yard collection. So in 1936, Jim Eade resigned from the Tate Gallery after having it found it quite difficult to work with his colleagues there. So he effectively retired at the age of 41, which I think is quite enviable. And he and Helen began spending part of the year in Tangier, where they commissioned a modernist house known as Whitestone. So on the next slide, there's a picture of that. So it's this beautiful white modernist house. And they like to joke that they'd found their Eden there, their Eden, partly because of the large, lush garden where Jim Eade spent much of his time planting, pruning, and weeding. In these photos of the interior at Whitestone, you can see some of the artworks and objects that have ended up at Kettle's Yard. For example, a painting by Christopher Wood above the fireplace, a cabinet full of ornate crockery, and the Chippendale mirror, which the Eades bought for themselves as a wedding present, which is now the source of many mirror selfies at Kettle's Yard. And there are also many of the architectural features which prefigure aspects of the Kettle's Yard house, such as the spacious interiors, whitewashed walls, and the harnessing of natural light. From 1937, the Eades began a series of extended visits to the United States, where Jim Eade gave lecture tours in aid of the war effort, and they also encountered some of the important Kettle's Yard artists there, such as William Congdon, who I'll speak about later. After the war and back in Tangier, they began hosting weekly retreats for small groups of British soldiers stationed in Gibraltar. Then in 1952, the Eades moved to France to a farmhouse in the Loire Valley called Les Charlotières. And this is a sweet, quite formal and very blurry snapshot of them standing outside the house with a trellis of roses. And then finally in 1956, they moved to Cambridge in order to realise their final scheme. They bought a group of 19th century cottages and converted them into a single house. And at the end of the year, Kettle's Yard opened to university students every weekday afternoon during term time. Then in a large extension to the house and a small gallery space designed by the architects Leslie Martin and David Owers opened in 1970. So that was a few years after Kettle's Yard had been donated to the university, and the extension constitutes a very large part of Kettle's Yard, so it's almost hard to imagine that it existed for so long without it. And it also opened only 3 years before the Eades left. So they didn't have that much time with Kettle's Yard in its sort of current form, but they did have a few years. So Jim Eade's vision for Kettle's Yard was very clear. It was a place that should not be, quote, an art gallery or museum, nor simply a collection of works of art reflecting my taste or the taste of a given period. It is rather a continuing way of life from these last 50 years in which stray objects, stones, glass, pictures, sculpture in light and in space have been used to make manifest the underlying stability, end quote. And I want to look more closely at some of the words and phrases that Jim Eade uses in that quote. He says that Kettle's Yard is a way of life, which is a phrase that's used a lot in relation to Kettle's Yard. It's the title of a book Jim Eade wrote in 1984, about a decade after he and Helen left for Edinburgh, which pairs photographs of the objects and arrangements in the house with stories and musings about them, often with quite a lot of detail about the price and how he came to have them. So this is one of the photographs that's included in A Way of Life. Ways of Life, plural, is the title of a biography of Jim Eade and the Kettle's Yard artists by Laura Freeman, which was published in 2023 and which I would highly recommend. In the quote, Jim Eade says that Kettle's Yard isn't an art gallery or museum. People have sometimes described Kettle's Yard as being an artwork in its own right, a total work of art which constitutes a perfectly balanced whole. Others have described it as an anti-museum, suggesting that its lived-in quality makes it an alternative model for a public art institution. Kettle's Yard does lie somewhere between being a home and a museum. As of a few years ago, it was granted museum accreditation by the Arts Council, but it retains the informality that the Eads intended it to have. For example, there are no labels or wall text accompanying the artworks. None of the artworks or objects are behind glass cases, which is really unusual and I think such a huge benefit for visitors that even ceramic pieces will be openly on display. Visitors are allowed to sit in the chairs and linger for as long as they want. And in fact, some of the artworks are only properly visible from a seated position, such as the paintings leant against walls and sculptures displayed on low tables. At the same time, Kettle's Yard was always as much presentational as it was domestic. From the very beginning, it was open to visitors, and Jim Eade would play the role of host and tour guide. It was also created with posterity in mind, with the idea that it would be donated to the University of Cambridge and experienced and enjoyed by future generations. And finally, to go back to the quote, Jim Eade says that all the objects and artworks at Kettle's Yard make manifest the underlying stability. It's often been suggested that Jim Eade's search for stability was a result of his traumatic experiences in the trenches during the First World War. He suffered from the psychological and physical effects of this trauma for the rest of his life. And fittingly, the word that people most often use to describe Kettle's Yard is as a sanctuary, a place of refuge away from the chaos of the outside world. But in addition to that, Jim Eade's understanding of stability was inseparable from his religious faith. He was brought up as a Methodist, was introduced to Christian Science and Roman Catholicism through his artist friends, and was baptized and confirmed as an Anglican while living at Kettle's Yard. And throughout his life, he also engaged with Eastern religions and philosophies. For Jim Eade and also Helen Eade, although we know a bit less about her views on most things because it's not as well documented, but certainly for Jim Eade, God was in everything, and to experience Kettle's Yard was to contemplate the beauty of divine creation. So what is Kettle's Yard today? Today, Kettle's Yard is a vibrant art centre in the heart of Cambridge. The gallery hosts 3 exhibitions a year with a range of modern contemporary artists, alongside a dynamic programme of events, learning activities, and music concerts. And at the heart of the gallery is the Houghton Collection, which is open Tuesday to Sunday between 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. So now I will take you on our virtual tour of the house. So to see the Kettle's Yard house, you can either book a ticket in advance or on the day. And when it comes to your timed slot, you are led out of the gallery entrance space to this unassuming wooden door, which is located in a shady passageway between 2 parts of the house. And a visitor in the group is asked to ring the bell, which is in fact a fishing net cork on the end of a rope, one of many found objects at Kettle's Yard. You can just about see it in the corner of this photo. And a visitor assistant opens the door and leads you into the first room, where they give you a short introduction to Kettle's Yard. So here is the first room that you enter, which was a joint sitting room, dining room, and study. And in the corner, you can see Jim Eade's Queen Anne bureau. This was Jim Eade's first ever furniture purchase. He bought it for £8, aged 12, which apparently was the price of a first-class bicycle at the time. And it was much to his parents' bemusement that he chose to buy this over a bicycle. But he described it as his dear companion for nearly 70 years. And at Kettle's Yard, the bureau was essentially his office, where he wrote dozens of letters each day in handwriting, which is very, very difficult to read. And he said that when the bell rang, he only had to close the lid and the office disappeared. And we like to joke that it was the equivalent of his iPad. So on the other side of the fireplace is this small recess, which served as the Eads dining room. This is where they would host visitors to tea and toast with marmalade, which was homemade in enormous batches by Helen Eade. And on the side next to the window, you can just about see Ben Nicholson's painting Apples and Pears, which I'll speak about now. So still life can sometimes seem like quite a traditional and unexciting subject, but at the beginning of the 20th century, it was used for very radical experiments with style and form. And I think that Ben Nicholson's Apples and Pears is an example of this. The apples and pears in this painting are only faintly hinted at. You can see the pencil marks where Nicholson sketched the fruit, and the brush strokes of the paint are left visible, so that the composition has a slightly unfinished quality to it. If you focus in closely on any one individual fruit, you might think that you were looking at an entirely abstract shape or form. But when you step back and see the entire composition, you intuitively know that what is being represented is an array of apples and pears. So Nicholson is investigating the boundaries of our perception here and the point at which a painted mark goes from being abstract to representational. This painting was an important work on Nicholson's journey towards abstraction. It was made in 1927, which was several years before he created his first geometric white relief using only squares and straight lines, squares and circles and straight lines. And his reliefs are the works for which he's best known and which made him a foremost proponent of abstract art in Britain. The placement of this painting in such a central spot shows its importance to Jim and Helen Eade. They first met Ben Nicholson and his wife, the artist Winifred Nicholson, in 1924 when they were living in Hampstead. And Ben Nicholson would regularly turn up to their house with his canvases in tow. And even though Winifred Nicholson was quite successfully selling her work, Ben Nicholson really struggled to sell or even give away his works at that time. So Jim Eade would buy them for little more than the cost of the canvas and frame, which was the case with this painting. It's rather more valuable now. So the apples and pears, which seem to float on the canvas in Nicholson paintings, form a visual connection with the lemon on a pewter plate nearby, which was deliberately placed there to echo parts of the artwork surrounding it, and continues to be replenished today. Just above the lemon is a dark and stormy seascape by the artist Alfred Wallace. And there are also a couple of Wallace's works in the next room right above Jim Eade's bed. So Wallace is one of the artists most closely associated with Kettle's Yard, as it holds the largest collection of his works in the world. Jim Eade remembered that in around 1926, Wallace began to send him bundles of his work, sometimes up to 60 at a time, from which he would choose several for a small fee and send back the rest. Given its placement above the bed, I think we can assume that this painting, Five Ships, Mounts Bay, was one of Jim Eade's favourites. It wasn't just his favourite. When the Art Fund asked the public to vote for their favourite British masterpieces back in 2013, this painting made it into the top 10. Ships at sea were the principal subject for Alfred Wallace. He spent much of his working life as a mariner and then as a scrapyard merchant living on the coast. He never had any formal training as an artist and only took up painting in his 70s to keep himself company after the death of his wife. He always painted from memory, recalling the boats and ships he had seen and sailed on, and he wrote regular letters to Jim Eade, often repeating that he painted, quote, what used to be. So people have often seen a nostalgic quality in his work. Despite being painted from memory, the ships in this painting are very accurate from a technical point of view. They're shown sailing into Mounts Bay, which was a place for shelter in stormy weather. And consistent with this, they have only a small amount of sail unfolded, which suggests that they've been prepared for strong winds and a possible storm. And we can also see Wallace's knowledge of the ships through his attention to detail in the rigging. The painting does, however, play with perspective. Wallace employed a kind of flattened or aerial viewpoint to distort the space in his paintings, a technique which recalls pre-Renaissance art. Loggers are small sailing boats, but in this composition, they appear monumental. And these two lighthouses also geographically wouldn't in reality be visible together, but he has brought them together in the composition. Wallace painted on anything and everything he could find. Most of his works were painted on old boards, packaging cases, and cardboard with household or ship paint. And the shape of the materials that he used usually dictated what the compositions would look like. He painted in a limited range of colours, mostly blues, greens, and greys, and would leave parts of the canvas or board unpainted so that the color of the material became part of the painting. Many of the over 100 Alfred Wallace paintings in the Kettle collection are on display in this long balcony passage in the extension part of the house. Jim Eade explained his decision to hang them in this way, saying, quote, "I decided to put most of them together so that they could be studied as a whole by those who liked him and easily passed by those who didn't." So I think there's a recognition of the fact that Wallace's work isn't to everyone's taste, but it certainly was enormously influential on a younger generation of British artists, including Ben Nicholson, Christopher Wood, and Barbara Hepworth. So you'll definitely see reverberations of it in other works at Kettle's Yard. So returning to Jimmy's bedroom, this is a low table opposite the bed and the Alfred Wallace painting with the spiral of pebbles, which has become one of the iconic symbols of Kettle's Yard. You'll find it on a lot of our merch in the Kettle's Yard shop. And I can, in fact, take credit for having put together the most recent iteration of the spiral of pebbles, because we had to do some maintenance work in that part of the house recently and decanted the works and then reinstalled them. And it was a very, very meditative task. And the spiral of pebbles has often been compared to a mandala, which is a spiritual symbol stemming from Hinduism and Buddhism that is meant to bring tranquility and enlightenment. And this connects to Jimmy's hope that Kettle's Yard would be a place where people could find inner peace. I certainly did come out from the task of putting it together feeling very peaceful. There are many more interesting works in Jimmy's bedroom and bathroom, but I'll now take you up the spiral staircase, an echo of the spiral of pebbles, to Helen Eade's sitting room and bedroom. So this is the upstairs sitting room, also known as the Best-Dine room, because of the piano in the middle of the room. Helen Eade was a keen musician and would often play pieces by Schubert, Beethoven, and Bach on her Best-Dine. And there would also be small musical recitals there before the Steinway in the extension was bought, which is where concerts now happen. And beyond the sitting room is Helen Eade's bedroom. So this is a photo from our archive of Helen Eade poking her head out from behind the bedroom door. I love her short fringe and rimless glasses and cardigan with a little Peter Pan collar. I think there's a lot to be said about Helen Eade and fashion, but that's probably the subject of another talk. In this photograph, she seems to be both inviting the person into her bedroom and shutting them out. And I think this is fitting because when the Eades lived in Kettle's Yard, Helen Eade's bedroom and bathroom were the only spaces closed to visitors. They remained her own private domain, so a kind of sanctuary within a sanctuary. Today, we use the room for changing displays, usually with works from our reserve collection, which consists of several hundred works which belong to Kettle's Yard but are not on permanent display in the house. Our current display is titled Turning Forms, based on the title of a print by Barbara Hepworth, and it focuses on artworks in states of transition, inspired by the shifting contents of Helene's rooms. And one of the works included in the display is Veronica Ryan's Territory. Some of you might be familiar with Veronica Ryan as the winner of the Turner Prize in 2022. She was born on the Caribbean island of Montserrat in 1956, which was the same year that the Eads bought the Kettle's Odd cottages, and she moved to the UK as a child. She mostly works in sculpture and assemblage using non-traditional materials such as metal, fabric, and even dust. And her works often reference shapes and forms found in the natural world. So fruit, seeds, plants, and vegetables are all recurring motifs and become metaphors for the artist's own sense of dislocation and, more broadly, the global trade of produce and people, concerns about climate breakdown, and cycles of life, death, and rebirth. The object depicted in Territories appears to be a narrow boat floating along the sea, containing a number of ceramic vessels. But the form of the boat also resembles an open seed, which is a different form of container. Though at first the pale blue background looks like waves under the grey sky, on closer inspection, you can see that the grey paint also extends to the side and the bottom of the paper. So these would-be waves are a kind of container too, and perhaps look like a piece of paper that the boat has kind of been painted on. The colour palette may remind you of Alfred Wallace's, particularly the light grey blue of the sea. And like in Ben Nicholson and Alfred Wallace's works that we've looked at, Ryan's brushstrokes here are rapidly applied and remain visible. One of the 4 compartments on the boat seems to have been scribbled out as though the artist is concealing it from the viewer. So there's this game of kind of hide and seek between the artist and viewer at play in this work. The reason that this work by Veronica Ryan is in the Kettle's Odd collection is that in 1986 to 87, she was artist in residence at the gallery in collaboration with Jesus College, Cambridge. And between the late 1970s and early 90s, Kettle's Yard ran a residency program for young artists. The residencies offered studio space, room and board in a Cambridge college, free use of the university's academic resources, and culminated with an exhibition at Kettle's Yard at the end of the year. And as well as a solo exhibition at the end of her residency, Ryan curated a group show midway through titled Dislocations, which included works by other artists of her generation like Mona Hatoum and Serena Bimji. So coming back out of Helene's bedroom to the sitting room, on the side there is a small wooden staircase that leads up to the attic. Up until 1970, the attic was where all the paintings and sculptures, which are now in the extension, were stored. By Jim Eads' estimation, about 400 works in total. It's difficult to imagine this because the attic is not a big room. And there's also a tiny cupboard space off the attic, which had 3 bunk beds where Jim and Helene's grandchildren slept when they came to stay, as well as the works which were lent to Cambridge students. And the tradition of lending works from the Kettle's Odd collection to students to hang in their rooms continues today. Back in the Eads time, students could borrow Ben Nicholson's and Alfred Wallace's. Nowadays, we're slightly more cautious about the works that are lent out, but students can still borrow beautiful original works of art to adorn their college rooms for the whole academic year. Having essentially been storage space for many years, in 1970, the attic was turned into a display room specifically dedicated to the work of Henri Gaudier-Breschke. There are 30 or so works on display at any one time, and these rotate as works on paper are extremely sensitive to light and need to be periodically rested. There were three main subjects in Henri Gaudier-Breschke's work: dancers, wrestlers, and animals. And I think that Gaudier-Breschke was drawn to these subjects in particular because they're rarely static, and he was fascinated by the challenge of capturing movement in art. He never had any artistic training, but sketched constantly, filling sketchbooks with his observations of everyday life. In 1911, he moved to London with his much older companion, Sophie Breschke, and added her last name to his own. He initially worked in isolation, but gradually integrated into a group of artists and intellectuals, including Ezra Pound and Wyndham Lewis and other members of the Vorticist group. Gaudier-Breschke lived in London for 3.5 years and produced thousands of drawings and over 100 sculptures. But after the First World War broke out, he enlisted in the French army and was killed in action in 1915, aged only 23. So it's one of the sort of big questions of 20th century art, of what he would have created if he hadn't died so prematurely. When Sophie Breschke died a few years later in a psychiatric hospital with no will, Gaudier-Breschke's entire estate ended up in the possession of the British Treasury and landed on Jim Eade's desk at the Tate. The Tate refused to acquire it, which is a sort of decision in a long line of decisions that were quite sort of antithetical to progress in modern art. And so Jim Eade acquired it himself through a slightly dodgy deal that would probably raise some eyebrows nowadays. Contained within the estate was the very ardent correspondence exchange between Henri and Sophie, which Jim Eade used as the basis for his book, Savage Messiah. And this was later adapted into a film of the same name directed by Ken Russell. If you're ever in the mood for an extremely high-octane viewing experience, that film is one to watch. I would say that Cat is one of Gaudier-Breschke's more static compositions. The cat of the title sits on its side and looks out at the viewer. The cat is, of course, very anatomically inaccurate. Its eyes are very high up on its face, which is perched on top of a towering neck. It has enormous nostrils, and its extremely long, winding tail seems to enclose its singular hind leg. On the three visible paws, one seems to have 7 toes, the other 5, and the third only 3. So really, it's barely a cat at all. And yet, even without knowing the title, we instinctively know that it is one. So a bit like with Ben Nicholson's Apples and Pears, here Gaudier-Breschke is playing with the point at which a combination of abstract lines and shapes or pure geometry start to resemble an animal form. And he uses an incredible economy of lines in this composition. I counted that the cat's head is just 1 unbroken line. The neck is 2, the body, excluding the toes, maybe 6. And look at how thickly and confidently he applies the ink to the paper. This artistic control is precisely what Jim Eade admired in Gaudier-Breschke's work. He wrote, "He has a swiftness and a certainty achieved by few, because a hoof or a tail touches the edge and a hat sails past unhindered. It must mean that he has complete control of his space, as a good motorist has of the width of his car." So a good motorist, or in this case, perhaps a good animal trainer. So from one animal to another, I'll now tell you about William State Murray's heron, which is nestled among the plants in the next part of the Kettle's Yard house known as the bridge. So the bridge is the area linking the older part of Kettle's Yard, composed of cottages, with the newer extension. There's a jungle-like conservatory of plants, including begonias, pelargoniums, and tradescantia. And according to Kettle's yard law, the current plants have been propagated over and over from cuttings made from the Eads plant. So these are the great grandchildren of the original ones. Placed in amongst the plants is William State Murray's heron, which is a tall, high-necked stoneware pot glazed in a greyish green colour and adorned with one deep purple brushstroke. On the surface, you can see the gentle echo of throwing rings, which is evidence that it was made on a potter's wheel. The famous anecdote attached to this work is that shortly after it was given to the Eads by State Murray, their friend, the artist David Jones, came to stay at their home in Hampstead and knocked it off one of the windowsills, shattering it into many pieces. When Jim Eade trepidatiously confessed this to State Murray, the potter was apparently overjoyed because it gave him the opportunity to mend it with the traditional Japanese technique of kintsugi. And he said that he'd always wanted to repair one of his works in that way, but didn't want to break one especially to do that. State Murray was born in London in 1881 and decided against working in his father's bulb and seed firm, and instead studied Buddhism and painting and experimented with bronze casting and earthenware plates. He was an early proponent of the idea that throne pots represented a branch of abstract sculpture rather than being merely functional objects. And in 1927, he became the sole ceramicist in the 7 and 5 Society and had joint exhibitions with the painters Ben and Winifred Nicholson and Christopher Wood. After his studies in Buddhism, he became one of the first practicing Buddhists in England. He viewed the act of making pots as a spiritual process, a fusion of consciousness between the potter, the material, and the act of throwing. And he saw the spiral movement of the clay on the wheel as representing the natural world, writing that, quote, the earth itself might almost be a vast potter's wheel. This spiral formation is to be seen everywhere in nature. In 1939, he went to visit relatives in Zimbabwe, then called Rhodesia, on a three-month trip and became stranded there for the duration of the war. He formed a Buddhist society and wrote poetry and ended up staying there for the rest of his life, but never from that moment made a single pot again. So going back to the bridge, you can see through to the next room, which is known as the dancer room, so called because of Gordia Breszka's sculpture, the dancer, which you can see on the table there. And to the side of the dancer is William Congdon's painting Piazza San Marco, number 25, brackets White Piazza, which is one of 14 works by Congdon in the Kettle's Yard collection. Jimmy described this painting as pearly white and pink, seen in a mist, but yet revealed. It's one of 2 views of St. Mark's Square in Venice by Congdon in the Kettle's Yard collection. And in this painting, which is the larger of the 2, the church is barely visible. I think on the next slide, there's a close-up of the painting. Yeah, so the domes hover in an autumnal mist, and the mosaics on the church's facade are subtly suggested by touches of gold. The grey-green striations seem to slide down from the sky, which appears to be in the midst of a rainstorm. The work would not have been made in the square itself, as Congdon favoured working from memory back in his studio. The techniques used in the painting are typical of his style. At this time, the paint is thickly applied and worked into with knives and needles. Congdon was born in Rhode Island into what he called, what he described as business, wealth, and Puritanism. he became associated with abstract expressionism and was represented in America by the same gallery as Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko. During the Second World War, he served as an ambulance driver in Africa and Italy, and he also spent a month working in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp shortly after its liberation, which deeply affected him. In the late 1950s, he settled permanently in Italy and converted to Catholicism, and from 1979 until his death, he lived in a monastery near Milan. Throughout his life, Congdon traveled extensively, and the Kettle's Yard collection features paintings from Italy, India, Guatemala, and Istanbul. The Eads met Congdon in 1950 during their visits to America, and Jim Ead maintained an intense, lively, and romantically charged correspondence with him over the next 40 years. Heading back to the corridor, you can see the door which leads to the 1970 extension. On the semicircular table next to the door is a beautiful marble sculpture called Spirality by the artist Kenji Umeda. Here is an image of it from Jim Ead's book, A Way of Life. In the book, Jim Ead explains how Umeda, then around 22 years old, dropped in on him at Kettle's Yard one day and showed him some of his paintings, which Ead described as strange but interesting. Finding him alone and in need, Ead offered to help him sell some of his works to undergraduates for a few pounds each. And at Ead's suggestion, Umeda started to come in twice a week for an hour or so to help Jim with the cleaning and to have coffee and a chat. After about a year, Umeda moved to Carrara in Italy, which is known as the home of marble. And apparently he worked all day and all night there for 4 years until he moved to America with his wife, who was also a sculptor. Then one day, out of the blue, after the Eads had moved to Edinburgh, the postman staggered in with a large wooden box, and inside was Spirality. And Jim Ead describes it as another conveyance of light and peace. Umeda died only a few years ago in 2019 in Phoenix, Arizona. Spirality is an elegant, elongated sculpture. It emerges from its base like a blossoming plant form, and in the center are 4 curved protrusions which come close to one another but don't quite touch. Just as important as the shape of the marble form is the negative space in the middle, which takes on different appearances from each angle. And the sculpture's title, Spirality, connects to various different spiral forms, which we've already seen at Kettle's Yard. And it has this name because of the spiral that emerges from the contours of the carved marble, but also because this is a sculpture that should be seen in the round. And I like to think that viewers themselves start to create a spiral with their bodies while looking at the sculpture from different angles. Coming out through the door next to which Umeda's sculpture is positioned, we emerge into the 1970 extension at Kettle's Yard, which is a larger, less domestic space. Across from here is the library, which has a collection of books which visitors are encouraged to read, and many a student dissertation has been written at this table. On the corner wall in the library, hidden from view in this photograph, is Christopher Wood's Boy with Cat, which is one of the best loved works in our collection. Christopher Wood is another artist closely associated with Kettle's Yard. There are various tragedies relating to Kettle's Yard artists. I've already told you about Gordia Breshka's death, aged 23, fighting in the First World War. Another is Christopher Wood's suicide, aged 29, when he was hit by a train at Salisbury Station during an opium-induced psychotic episode. Jim Ead was devastated by the untimely death of his friend and continued to promote his legacy for the rest of his life. He would keep a piece of fabric with Wood's initials on him, which we still have in our archive. Christopher Wood, nicknamed Kit, was born near Liverpool in 1901. Although he had no formal artistic training, like various other Kettle artists, he went to Paris in 1921 with the ambition of becoming, quote, the greatest painter that ever lived. He soon established himself as a prominent and popular figure among the artistic and social circles of the 1920s Paris avant-garde, and he mingled with aristocrats and won the admiration of Picasso and Jean Cocteau. Through Cocteau, the French poet, playwright, novelist, and general polymath, Wood met Jean Bourgoin, who is the subject of this portrait. Cocteau later based the main character in his novel Les Enfants Terribles on Jean and his sister Jeanne. And I love the boldness of siblings being called Jean and Jeanne. Wood was attracted to the Bourgoin's ambiguous sexuality, and he was particularly drawn to the tomboyish looks of Jeanne, with whom he had a brief but intense affair. He painted solo portraits of the siblings, in both of which they have an animal companion. In the portrait of Jean, he holds a Siamese cat with very sharp claws and blue eyes, which exactly match his own. Cats have traditionally symbolized promiscuity, so this cat suggests a thinly veiled feline sexuality. And cats have become a sort of accidental theme in this talk. In the portrait of Jeanne, quite literally the sister painting to Jean's, she has a red fox pelt on her lap. This might signal her fashionable tastes. Traditionally, foxes have also been associated with cunning trickery, so this element adds a wild edge to Jeanne's quite demure pose. Beneath the library is the lower level of the extension, where concerts are held during Cambridge term time. To one side is the much celebrated white sofa, which is in fact just two single mattresses placed in a row. And on the other side is a cluster of works by Ben Nicholson from different points in his career. And next to them is the Thai Buddha sculpture on a wooden plinth, which is estimated to be from the 13th or 14th century. And Jimmy describes it as sitting, quote, beyond time and space in its pose of calm and emanating an ever-increasing power. And this is a reminder again that Kettle's Yard was conceived as a place of peace and tranquility, somehow separate to everyday life. And finally, my last slide, which is an image of the corner of the lower extension with this wonderful black and white triptych by the Italian artist Italo Valenti. I will end my talk there. I hope you've enjoyed this brief tour of Kettle's Yard and that the sound issues haven't marred it too much. As I mentioned earlier, the house is open Tuesday to Sunday between 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. and I would very much encourage you to visit yourselves. The curation highlighting the works which I've spoken about today will be live on Art UK very soon. And as Hazel mentioned, we have also recently launched our profile on the Bloomberg Connect app, so you can check it out either during your visit or at home. As well as the house and collection, you can enjoy our current exhibition, Echoes and Hours, which features the work of the contemporary artist Megan Rooney. And you can also stay in touch with us by following us on social media or sign up to our weekly email newsletter. Thank you so much for listening. Do let me know if you have any questions at all.